So we have Liz Herman from Earthsoft is here. Ruth Callahan is also here from Earthsoft and on the panel with us. So you guys might hear Ruth's voice pipe up from time to time here as well. But then we have Polly Newbold from DDMS and Dee Shepard from DDMS, and really they're going to be our main presenters, and they're going to be doing, I think, all the hard work today, ladies. So we really appreciate that. We are so excited to sort of have this opportunity to put this series together. For those of you guys that don't realize it, this is a 3-part webinar series, and so we're going to talk about a lot of great stuff today, but then we'll have more to get into in part 2 and part 3, and I think Dee will allude to some of those things perhaps. So anyway, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. The other thing, just to warn you guys, we will have a couple of poll questions as well. So when I put those up on the screen, you guys can actually click on the poll questions to provide your answers and give some feedback and stuff. So without further ado, Polly, I think you were going to say a few words, but Dee, I'll go ahead and make you the presenter, and we can make sure that we can see all that stuff. And Polly, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks. As she said, we are from DDMS, and DDMS specializes in environmental chemistry services, environmental data management, analysis, and visualization services. The Environmental Chemistry Services Group, or ECS Group, has extensive experience in the environmental arena, including collecting and analyzing samples, project planning, and litigation support. And we also perform data review and validation for a variety of clients. So we were looking for a way to take some of the grunt work out of the routine review, and so that would enable us to concentrate on the parts of the process that really need the attention of a validator. And Earthsoft's DQM was selected to fill that role. So DDMS would like to thank Earthsoft for this opportunity and collaborating on this 3-part series, and to share details on how DDMS is using the Earthsoft DQM product to assist in our data reviews and our validation projects. So Dee, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, thanks, Polly, and thanks everybody, and glad you're all here. We're going to talk a bit about what we're doing with DQM, and since we don't really know the background of everybody that's on, I'm going to kind of start with the basics, and if I'm telling you things you already know, just kind of ignore it and we'll move forward. So the first thing that we wanted to impart is, what is data validation all about, or data review and validation? And we kind of liken it to this. It's like an immunization. People don't really like the shot, but they really don't want to get sick either. So it's usually a good idea. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the process involved, but it all boils down to the 2 questions that you're asking when you submit samples to a laboratory. You want to know 2 things. You want to know what's there, and what isn't there can sometimes be even more important. And you want to know how much is there. And again, the non-detects are just as important, sometimes more important than what's actually there. And in order to get there, we want to make sure that we have data that we can stand behind. So you want to be able to be confident that you can prove that those results are good to use for making decisions. I think everybody probably on this webinar uses analytical data to make decisions, probably pretty important decisions. They involve human health or the health and well-being of the environment. And so you need to be able to make sure they're well supported. Some of us have ended up in situations where we had to go forward and defend something in a litigious situation, or for an agency or whatever. And that's when it becomes really critical and it's kind of too late. So it's good to do the work ahead of time. So what do you get when you validate or review data? What are you looking for as a product? The things that you want to be able to get some kind of handle on are accuracy, how close to true value is the result that you're getting. And keep in mind that there are a lot of variables here. It starts with the field collection. It starts with the way that's set up. It goes all the way through the laboratory process. Lots of variables, lots of things in play. You also want to be able to get a handle on how much spread there is. If I run multiple replicates or duplicates, whether field or laboratory, how far apart are my results likely to be? That's all part of the error term, and that's what you're trying to find out. And then the last piece, of course, for the review or validation process is to make sure that you've got the adequate data in hand to be able to support whatever you're claiming your results are going to be. And that can be very important, and it can also be a really big job. So let's see, we have a poll question out.
Yeah, here, let me launch it actually really quick. I didn't yet. I was waiting. So let's do that really quick. Yeah, so Dee said, she thought that probably everybody here used analytical data for decision making, but the question is, how often? So feel free to answer this here, and you can, if there's other options, you can tell us in the chat or rather in the questions pane, and we'll give this just another couple of seconds here. Most everybody's voted, it looks like. And I'll tell you guys that most folks are saying always. Always or sometimes are the two big winners. We have a couple of nevers and a couple of rarelys, but most everybody is saying always. About 75% of folks, with 20% saying sometimes. So there we have it.
Well, so then I'm going to be telling everybody a lot of stuff they already know. So that's good, though. It's just a review. And there are a lot of arguments over how much to validate, how much to review, what level to review. We all know, budgets are tight. Everybody's always looking for ways to save money. Time is short. A lot of times you've got crews and stuff waiting on decisions, so you want to get things to move quickly. There are different levels of validation and review, and they can be used interchangeably. You may want to look at some parameters or some methods more closely. You may have a few drivers on the site and the other stuff isn't nearly as important, those kind of things. So you make decisions based on that. When I give trainings in the labs, I always tell everybody that the result that you're putting out as a reported result for a sample is like that tiny little tip on the pyramid. And there's a whole body of stuff that supports that. And the different levels of review are different levels of looking at that pyramid. You can look at just the summary forms up in the top, or a 2A, which essentially is kind of everything that you'd see in an EDD. I'm assuming everybody's pretty familiar with electronic data deliverables that you can, upload to a database or pull out of there and then perform all kinds of wonderful things on. A couple of other things that get done manually are looking at sample integrity and custody, and completeness, which could be a lot of different things. It's and we'll go over that shortly. So if you start with just the very tip of the pyramid with the results and maybe some summary forms, and then you can go down deeper and go into, there's so many levels and stages of validation, but each one adds more elements. You might be looking at some of the raw data like calibrations and things like that. You may not be looking at everything. When you get down to the bottom of the pyramid and you're looking at a full data validation, you're looking at pretty much everything that goes into that, all the traceability behind all the reference materials, the equipment, the training, everything. So like I say, it's a balance. You find a balance that can fit your project's needs, and it can change over time too. Let's see if I can advance the slide. There we go. So what do you need in order to be able to do data validation? Well, you need data. That can be in a lot of different forms. And again, it depends a lot on what kind of review you're doing, how much you want to look at, and if you have any particular concerns, based on the site history or anything like that. So first off, you need some amount of data, whether it's just the summary forms to do a review or all the way to every piece of raw data that's produced. And then you need the sample documentation for integrity of your sample, knowing that it's been preserved correctly and all that. And then you also need to know what rule book you're following. Everybody has their own set of rules. I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with CLP and National Functional Guidelines, which is a very prescribed program, but there are lots of other ones out there too. And so although sometimes they are a bit loose, there are rule sets out there, and you got to kind of stick to those to make sure you're doing what needs to get done for that particular site or project or whatever. So you need to know the scope. Those can be things like the QuAP, the field sampling plan. Any of those kind of documents can form the rule book for a review and validation effort. So once the data has all been reviewed or validated, what do you want to have at the output from that process? So you want to know that your results are accurate, and that's, to me, is two different things. The qualitative, you want to make sure that what has been identified and reported is actually a true sample component. You want to know that it's been identified correctly, and you also want to know that those you're not looking at something that's an artifact from the laboratory. Everybody's been familiar with, common lab contaminants that show up in volatiles like methyl chloride and acetone. There are common contaminants that show up in extractables. There are phthalates that are ubiquitous in every lab and in the environment also. But that's the first piece you want to know. And then you want to know how solid those results are. How close to true value do you think they are? And there are a lot of quality elements in the laboratory analyses prescribed in the methods or by the laboratory's quality program that allow you to get some kind of assessment on that. Sometimes you can tell whether you have like a high bias, potentially, or a low bias, or sometimes you can't tell what direction. And that's oftentimes when there are multiple things that are out of whack. Precision is another part of the error term, and it's sort of additive. So if you're looking at multiple runs of a sample, multiple extractions of a sample, field is a whole nother issue, although sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference. When you're just looking at laboratory data, it can be very difficult to pull the field variability away from the laboratory variability. There are improvements to that are happening, but it's still difficult. Representativeness, you may be able to get some of that information. It depends on what you start out with. You can only review and validate what you see. The scope for some projects will ask whether the DQOs have been met, the data quality objectives for that particular sampling event. There are things that you wanted to know, and you have to know that those are solid. Validation may have covered that if that was one of the things that was requested. Project action limits, that's another biggie. And again, if that's assessed for the particular project and for that data set, you want to know about that. Completeness, and like we said before, this one's kind of, it's a big subject. It can be just the completeness of the data package or the data that are available. And that would be, are all the reports present? Do you have all the summary forms? Do you have all the right data? All of the pieces. I like to think of, everybody knows CLP, and that is sort of like the Six Sigma for laboratory data. The effort was to make sure that no matter what laboratory was doing the work or how they were putting it together, when the data were completed, you would have a package where you'd know what you were getting and you'd know pretty much where it was going to be. So anybody could pick up a data package from anywhere and they could make sense of it and review it and look at what was there and know. Then another piece is with completeness, and this isn't always something that's present in a data package and is usually only looked at if there's a question about something, but would be traceability of any of the reference materials and equipment and the analysts and their training and all that too. All right, and other things that can be incorporated into completeness also are part of the, did they adhere to the QuAP or the plan? Those are things like, did QC samples get analyzed at the appropriate frequency? Were calibrations run at appropriate frequencies? Did the correct samples get run? Were, even taken? Were they run for the right methods? Were they run for the right analytes? All of these things can be considered completeness for your data. And then the last couple are things like, Do you have what you need to support it? And are the data good? Did the lab make good decisions? That's kind of, sounds like a big gray area. It is, but that's kind of an overall assessment of your data set, looking at it. How comfortable should you be with it? How confident, how reliable is the data set? All right, so comparison to the QuAP, that's oftentimes a very important piece. If a reviewer or validator doesn't have the QuAP, that's going to be trouble. So we like to say that everybody should get that information out ahead of time. Project limits, project specific, those things are extremely important when you're working on some closure or a spot where you've got to meet a particular limit. If you're not under it, then you have to take further action. So those are really important to know. And again, just do the data make analytical sense. We have seen some really crazy stuff. I'm sure everybody has. And the more you know about the site or the project or the type of matrix you're working with or the laboratory, the better you can judge that. And sometimes things just come out wrong. I can think of an instance recently where we had a method that was run. We had an analyte that was reported that was very scary to the client because it was something they'd never seen at the site before. And come to find out that the method that was used was really good for several different analytes, but it had to be tweaked slightly in how it was run. And the wrong thing got somehow or another into the request at the laboratory. So if you looked at it, it looked like everything was just dandy and that was a real analyte, but it was not at all what they were looking for. And once we found out all about the project, then we could go a little bit backwards and figure out what was going on and solve that problem. So the more you know, the better you can do that job.
And
okay.
Dee, before we talk too much about the output, do we want to do our next poll question about whether folks have their data validated? Okay, let me launch it here.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a tough one, guys. Do you have your data validated? Yes, no, or sometimes?
Kind of related to that other one, so yeah.
Exactly, and we'll give you guys just, I don't know, 5 more seconds or so to vote here. 75% of folks have voted, so it's most of us.
Wow, these people are on top of it.
I know, everybody knows where to click on their screen and the whole deal. It's pretty good.
That's the biggest part of it right there.
It is, scrambling for that mouse. So, okay, so of the folks that voted, 53% say sometimes, 6% say no, and 40% say yes. So, perfect.
Oh, cool. That, like I say, there's a lot of different decisions that go into that question of whether you're going to validate or how much you're going to validate. And a lot of it, we deal with a lot of projects that are like legacy projects. They've been around for a long time. And, you're not expecting anything very strange. So you can kind of back off and only dive in when you see something weird or something changes. These are like validation 101, but I thought I'd throw them up there. Most people are quite familiar with them. These aren't all the qualifiers that are out there, but they're ones that are pretty common to anybody that's doing any kind of analytical work. So the actions that you take as a result of the review process, you might estimate results because you know the error term is bigger than acceptable for the particular methodology. You might know the direction because you've seen really high spikes or really low spikes. So you might be able to say, you probably have a low bias or a high bias. And if you think about an analytical result of 10, perhaps, if I see a matrix spike recovery or a laboratory, a blank spike recovery of 50%, that tells me I got a pretty wide error term. And if I see some other things that are in the data set that contribute to that also, then I might say, wow, I need to estimate the value because it could be 5 or it could be 15. Could be important information, especially if you're trying to meet some sort of a criteria, an action limit. And of course, the non-detects get qualified as estimated too, because you're not always sure that the reporting limit or MDL, which we don't recommend that you use to report if you don't absolutely have to, but you may not feel real comfortable that that's a good solid number. So sometimes that gets estimated also. Sometimes you have to remove a result and call it non-detected. That could be because it's present in blanks or in either in field situations, in storage, like a holding blank or trip blanks. So sometimes those things are removed. If you have numerous samples from the site, field duplicates or triplicates or whatever, and you're seeing it in one sample and not in another at a low value, it might be prudent to raise the reporting limit and call it a non-detect. It depends on, again, what the purpose of the data are. Tentative, if the ID criteria for a compound are not met, then you're going to want to call it tentative. In the case where there might actually be a calibration that's functional for that compound, but it's not the right one, you may not have to estimate it, but where it's an unknown, it's going to be NJ because it has to be estimated. Rejection of data is always like the last resort, but it happens because sometimes there's so much wrong. So many quality elements are out, or you're so unsure of the result that you have to just get rid of it. And you want to be careful that when rejected data are rejected for use, don't use them. I was in a legal case where I was on the prosecutorial side and the other side was showing us results for a compound, well, an analyte, a multi-compound analyte that they had reported in their data, but what they failed to notice was that there were R's attached to that. So it made my job really easy, but it wasn't really good for them. So when a data point's rejected, take that seriously. You can't use that result. So how do you do this? Well, we can do it manually. We can do it with automation. We can do a combination of the two, which is good. We always like to say that you can get fast, cheap, or good. You definitely can get one. Sometimes you get two, but you really don't ever get three. It is a balance. You have to find what you can live with. Some of it is about what risk you can take for different parts of the data, different analytes. If you're just getting started on a site, you may need to know. You could be doing forward searches where you really, really need to know what's going on. That might be a really in-depth dive, but later on, you might be able to back away. Can you do, it's typical to do like 10% of the data full validation and then the rest reduced, 20%, whatever, one SDG, one method, whatever you can make work for your site or your project makes sense. And then if you see something, worrisome, then you can always go back in and look at things a little closer. So when we do manual data validation, there are pros, just like anything, there are pros and cons. Some of the things that are great about it are that somebody is actually looking at stuff pretty closely because they pretty much have to. And you do have the experience and the judgment of validators. So you've got generally lab experience, quality experience, all those things kind of rolled up in one. So they're going to see things that you just might not notice if you're just looking at a very top level reduced, here are the results kind of review. Remember that pyramid. You have the ability to dive down in there and look at a lot of other stuff. And then also the defensibility item for stuff. If you know it's going to be a legal issue or you know that the agency is going to question it at some point, it's a good thing to get somebody's eyes on it. The cons are, of course, it costs time and costs money. It takes time. Sometimes it takes a lot of time, depending on how much data there are and how many different parameters and matrices, all of that enters into the time and money equation. And there are errors. There's opportunity for error. We've seen things where you might miss a QC exception. Anybody who's ever filtered and sorted in an Excel file knows how easy it is to make a mistake, not realize you have a filter turned on or whatever. Even if you try very carefully to follow your stepwise process, you can still, make mistakes. And then the other part of that is taking your qualifiers and then applying them to EDDs manually it's another opportunity for errors, like transcription errors. And we always like to say that, remember, any data, even 10 years down the road can end up in a legal defense situation. So keep that in mind. There are occasions when you're pretty sure it's not going to, but just keep in mind that it can happen. All right, so doing an automated review, obviously you can do it faster, and obviously that's going to save you some money, so it's good. And it can also reduce errors. DQM does a lot better job of filtering things than one of us sitting there with a spreadsheet. So for a lot of the grunt work, it's great. It will get through that stuff and doesn't miss anything. If it's been set up properly, it works. The other piece that I like is once you're all done and you're happy with what you've got, you can push a button and apply qualifiers automatically to the results in the database. That's huge because that's one of the places where I feel, well, most of us feel that that's the biggest spot for errors to occur. The cons, well, you can only work with what's in an EDD. And in the future sessions, we'll get into some more of that because there are, you know, EDDs are a mixed bag. Some have just the bare minimum. They can be the Cadillac. You can have everything you can think of in there. There are modules available to do that kind of work. And we'll get into some more of that because the more you have in there, the more you can run tests on. So it's a good system. So the automation, no matter what you're using, can only do specific things. I mean, it's a logic-based system. You've got, if it fits this criteria, it passes through. If it doesn't, it's held up as an exception. Setup time can be pretty big on these things. DDMS has people who are using DQM for projects, but in most cases, it's a single project with a single set of rules, you know, well-defined data sets that are coming in repetitively. So for us, in the ECS group to use it, we're going to do it a little differently, which I'll show you. The other part is that you've got to have data that you can actually get into the DQM process. Sometimes labs that are using EarthSoft products already, most labs can also produce custom EDDs for you in pretty much any way you want. Not everybody, but some can. And so, you know, it is a hurdle, but it can be overcome. And then the other part is kind of related to that is that valid values have to match. You have to be able to match everything that shows up in a given cell has to match, or you're not going to be able to go with it. If you call an analyte, you know, if you have the wrong CAS number in there, if you have the wrong method, if it doesn't, the syntax doesn't quite match, it's not going to work. So there's some upfront work that has to be done. So what is DQM? Data qualification module. So like we discussed, it performs specific tests on your analytical data, checks, and then it can automatically apply those qualifications to results. I like to think of it kind of like a sieve, because what you're doing is you're kind of putting all this massive data in there. Everything that passes criteria kind of falls through the sieve, and you can kind of pretty much ignore all that. And then what's left in the sieve are the pieces that don't make it because they didn't pass the criteria, and then you can concentrate on those. And DQM gives you a very nice review screen. It's a multi-tab frame, which we will show you in the next presentations that we do. Each exception report is laid out so that you can review everything that didn't meet criteria, make decisions on it, edit whatever you need to, add things as you need them. And then when you're absolutely happy with it, you can go ahead and move on. And then, like I say, the beauty is it applies those results automatically. So the way DQM is designed to work is for a defined set of data, for a defined set of methods, a defined set of rules. So if you have a project and you are going to run DQM, you set it up for that project and away you go. It's very nice. Of course, what ECS wants to do at DDMS is we just want one big old box. We want to put everything in there. We want to be able to run pretty much any project through it, any analyte, any matrix. So that's a big task, and it's a little bit turning DQM on its head, but it can be done, and we're doing it. It's just, again, there's some hurdles, and these ladies work with us and we get there, so it's working. So what we've done is we've tried to create rules and tests that are default that cover the biggest number of cases, and then we can deal with the oddballs off to the side in their own boxes, if you will, and then put it all together at the end. So that's how we're handling that. So the checks that DQM does now, these are some of the ones that it does currently, and some of the ones that are of most interest to us at ECS. The team at Airsoft is constantly working on new ones. They have a schedule that they'll share with you later on about the new things that are adding and the improvements to ones that are already there. And it is an interactive process. They get feedback from users constantly, and from that they can figure out which things are most important to the users and can work on those sort of in a sensible order to hit the ones that are most important first. So I'll let them share with you in later sessions what those things are. And we're really excited about it because some of the things that we've found to be problematic are going to be added or solved. So it's a great thing. All right, so what DQM does not, it's not designed to do the things that aren't in the EDD or the things that don't, come out of the database. So chain of custody is one. There are options there that we'll discuss later on because, again, whatever's in an EDD or in an electronic format it's amenable to DQM at some point or at some series of checks that can be run. So this is going to be an ongoing process, and it's going to be built constantly larger. Data completeness, again, there are completeness checks that can be done within DQM, and there are some that at this point cannot. And it depends on what those entail and what's in the scope of the project. Instrument performance, those are things like instrument tunes or chromatography checks, that kind of stuff. There's no electronic solution at this point. There are people that are talking about them, but they're not there yet. Calibration, it's another one that could ostensibly be done because there are, that you get all of that stuff in electronic format and shove it into the limbs. So there's no reason why that couldn't be done eventually. Chromatograms, that's another one that will be a tough one, but peak shape and things like that, it's all data, so it's not out of the question. Same with spectra. We already do searches. Anybody that knows Biller-Beaman plots knows if we could go there. So, right now, these are things that don't happen automatically, but 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever, stuff, it'll improve. Other raw data, there are, prep logs and there's a lot of raw data in there that DQM doesn't look at this point. Again, the more that laboratories go to electronic notebooks and all of that, and that is, we're zooming along on that. So that's stuff that can happen. Calculations, they're already working on some stuff to do some calculations, but in a full data validation involves reproducing results, reproducing a lot of calibration information and all that kind of stuff. Not there automatically yet, but all of us have spreadsheets that we've built and used, so it'll happen. Professional judgment, that's going to be a tough one. I don't know that that's ever going to be an automated thing, but the beauty of using the automation is it allows you to expend your time and energy on the things that need the professional judgment and not do a lot of the grunt work that can be done better by a computer. Common sense, same kind of thing in the overall assessment. Those are things that right now you and maybe always will need a human to look at. Generation of validation or review reports. There are options already to do some custom reports. What we are at DDMS, we're kind of taking DQM output and then creating our own reports because we have clients, a lot of different clients, different needs when it comes to reporting. So that's another part that Airsoft is working on and will be making improvements and expansion to. So, but in the meanwhile, it's not that difficult to take the output and do your own thing with it too. Okay, so DDMS, we are using DQM in two different ways. And these will be the subjects of two upcoming webinars that will follow in a couple of weeks. and we will get down into the nitty gritty and show you how all this works. For a 2A review, DQM pretty much does what we need. It's going to take the EDDs, it's going to filter through everything like the sieve we talked about, and it's going to find the things that are exceptions and then give the reviewer the opportunity to look at all that, make decisions, add professional judgment, you know, and edit as needed to make a final product out of that. And there will be still, we do the sample custody portion. Holding time is handled in DQM, but preservatives, which is an up and coming thing, and things like the actual legal custody of the samples, whether it's been signed off and has an unbroken chain, those kind of things we're doing manually. The other part we're doing manually at this point, well, semi-manually, we're taking the output, the final output, and we're shoving that into custom reports that we have created for particular clients or particular programs. The other way that we're using DQM is to do that front-end grunt work for a higher level, for a validation or a higher level review. So we can get a report of all the outliers right off the bat. And then we can take validator time and energy and your cost as a client to spend that time on things that need our attention and not the simple filtering of what didn't make criteria. And again, again, what we can do at the end of that is we can take those pieces, that output, and we can use that to pop into a more like a complete full validation report, the text-based reports that you're accustomed to seeing for those kind of things. Excuse me. Okay, so important things to remember about this whole process are, once you've got the DQM process set up, you've built your EQuIS, which is your sieve, your framework, all the rules, excuse me, and all the limits and all that. You have to be vigilant because things can go wrong. So it's important to keep an eye on, we recommend that you validate what you're doing using DQM periodically. You want to check things. You want to make sure that it's still working right. If you make a change in one of the rules or in one of the limits or something, there are a lot of interrelated tables. You can screw things up without realizing it. So it's really important to keep an eye on things, especially the way that we're using it. If you're only using it for one project with one set of rules, you still want to keep an eye on it, but you're less likely to have unintended consequences from something happening. But we all know about valid value creep and watching things go sideways and not realizing it until the other end, and you're going, that isn't right. Something's gone wrong. So we need to keep an eye on it. We're using the DQM with our pre-sample checks and the post work to put it into a report. And that's working for a 2A review. It works quite nicely. We still recommend you use third-party validation in those situations where you definitely need it, and go all the way for full validation when you run into something odd. Like, you may have been doing the site for 20 years, but when you change a lab or the lab gets bought by someone else and changes the way they operate, which we know happens, if they start using a different method, if they've gotten new instruments or a different vendor in, if the QAP has been changed drastically, if the scope of the project's changed, a lot of things like that can throw a wrench in the works, and it's good to know that up front. ECS unfortunately gets called in a lot of times after things have gone wrong, and then it's help. Can you fix this? Can you save us? What can we do? And you hope that you can, and sometimes at least something's salvageable, but you're out there with a mobilized crew, you're getting samples and all that. You can't redo that. You can't capture that moment in time. So if you anticipate there might be changes, it might be a good time to dig in and go all the way to the bottom of the pyramid. There will still be, no matter what kind of combination you're going to use for automation, there's still going to be stuff that has to be done manually, or you're going to want to do it manually, even if it's just to check up on what's being done automatically. So do some parallel validation or whatever it takes to make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting. And then there's still going to be professional judgment. There's, like I say, we can tell you all kinds of war stories if you want to hear them about places where that went wrong and what we wish we could have done ahead of time, that it's when it's too late. So this is what I've been blathering on about. In order to mitigate risk, make sure that you don't end up at the end of the road and find out that something went sideways, back a ways. Keep an eye on things. You know, anybody that's worked with labs or with your own software, you know, things can go sideways and you can absolutely not even know it. Labs have to validate their LIMS systems and their instrument software periodically, well, or they're supposed to, in order to make sure that none of that happens. Anybody that's tried to integrate a whole lot of different vendors' software systems and put data together knows how many opportunities there are for things to go wrong. So I can't say enough about just keeping an eye on things and making sure that you know that you're still, what's going on in the box has got to be right. And then if you've got project specific, configurations, you still want to validate that every once in a while and just make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting and things that haven't kind of crept out of the norm. So things to keep in mind and recommendations to make it work, because you don't want to come back and find out it was operator error. That's not a good thing. So I think that's all I had to say. That was a lot. So if anybody has questions, comments, like I say, we're gonna come back and do 2 sessions on the 2 different ways that we use DQM, and we will do some demos and show you the ins and outs of all that. And we'll also hear from Earthsoft on some of the newer things that are coming down the pipeline, and get an opportunity to see what's next.
Thanks, Dee. There were a couple of more comments than questions, but it's stuff that you sort of echoed as you moved through the presentation. One of them was that pointing out that Canada does not have a validation requirement or process. So that, when we were asking that poll question of who's doing what and all of that, that's when that came up. And then one of the other comments was really what you spent a chunk of time talking about here at the end, which was that validation will not catch all issues. And this particular comment says, we found a systematic, there's more questions coming in, hold on. We found a systematic lab issue after validation during the data evaluation. So I loved your analogy of the sieve, especially because that I think was a really good illustration of, it's hopefully catching as much as possible, but it's still, absolutely.
Like I say, I think that does a better job. DQM does a better job than I do, because I tend to, oops. I always try to follow my process in that I clear all my filters before I start any process. But it's easy to make mistakes. It's very easy to do that. About cannabis, they're just starting to have actual, we've been, as ECS has gotten involved in some of the work being done there, and they're just starting to put together like methods that are prescribed for the analyses. And it's true, we're not requiring things. The FDA has been really slow to step in on any of that stuff, and so there's very little going on. And I have to joke about seeing signs where I see for CBD and things where it says lab tested, and you just kind of scratch your head and wonder, what's going on there. But a lot of those methodologies are the same as what are being used for environmental samples. When you're looking at pesticides, when you're looking at the mycology, those kind of things are not anything, they're not rocket science. It's a different matrix, but it's not that different. Food science has its own set of validation criteria. Good laboratory practice is pharmaceuticals, all of those things. So it's not alien. It's just nobody's really wrapped regulations around it yet, but that's coming too. It's going to happen.
Absolutely. And then here's a question for, well, I don't know, one of you ladies. I'll let you guys fight over who answers it, but it says, this may be covered later, but have you found a way to get an EDD from the lab to feed DQM? And in this case, talking about inputs as opposed to project data.
I can add, that's coming soon. There will be an EQuIS standard format that has all of the criteria of like the specific fields that need to be populated and all of that for all of the various checks in DQM. Yeah, glad to see you're celebrating that, yes. But in terms of getting the lab to provide that, I'll defer to Dee and Polly about that for the current EDD requirements that they have. So,
well, we encounter pretty much everything. I mean, there are labs that are creating an EQuIS friendly, some of them are producing an EQuIS EDD. That's great. Some of them are producing EDDs that are basically a spreadsheet. I mean, there's small labs, big labs, there's network labs, and even that, a lot of them, they may, when somebody buys up a whole lot of labs and creates a network, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all using the same software or all doing the same thing. So there's different levels of that too. Usually for bigger projects and the bigger chains, you can generally get them to produce an EDD that you can use. But I'm not going to say that it's always foolproof, because even then there can be things that don't mesh up. A nice thing though about EDP is that it's going to show you, when you try to load it, it's going to show you things that are wrong, so you have an opportunity to fix them. And I think a good process is to then, if you have a lab that you use normally, if you're encountering errors and like that, you can go back to them, start a dialogue and say, hey, can we fix this? Because we'd like this to go a little smoother. And, it may be part of the process. Now, for a lab, stepping on that other side of the wall, it's, that's like a battleship that you're trying to turn. So be cognizant of the fact that it's not easy to make changes on the battleship, because there's so much going on there. And again, they're kind of stuck against it to use a lot of different types of vendor software and instrument software and all that kind of stuff. So, some of the stuff that was built out for them has been built out for years, and it's not a trivial thing. But if you're doing enough work with them and you talk with them, you can generally get them to they want to make their clients happy, so they can generally find a way to get what you need. Some of the small labs that we work with, we don't even get EDDs, so that's a whole different issue, and DQM obviously isn't going to fly with that. But that, again, there are ways to deal with that, but it's not, if you're going to do one project with that one lab, it's not worth your effort to build a whole thing and create an EDD manually and all that just so you can run it through DQM. So, you have to kind of weigh those things and figure out what makes sense. I hope that sort of answers the question. I'm not sure.
I think so. Yeah,
definitely. And there's a follow-up question from somebody else that I think kind of goes to what you were just saying, Dee. This attendee asks, how does DQM differ from SED and ADR software? And I would say, first and foremost, because it's part of the full, EQuIS ecosystem, you have things like EQuIS Data Processor that's checking your data before it comes in. So some of the idiosyncrasies that might show up in something like an ADR or SED are limited more. But in terms of additional, feedback that you all have, Dee or Polly, I defer to you for that as well.
Polly, you want to? We did look at several different options before we chose DQM, and that is, I think EarthSoft has. How do I put that right? Like potential to wrap their arms around more of the data now and in the future, because they're definitely working on, improving and expanding what we can actually get electronically. So I call that like the cradle to grave approach for the whole data management thing. And I think that's, that EarthSoft has that potential. I'm not going to say I know everything about ADR. We demoed it and looked at it, but, I had a lot of questions there too. They all have their limitations. There's other ones out there too that we've looked at that are small ones, but, they all have their good points and bad, but this suited our purpose best and looked like it would have the most potential going forward. So that's where we are.
Cool.
Awesome. There are a few questions in here that are kind of forward thinking, maybe for upcoming presentations. So maybe I'll read them so that we can hear them and plan to talk about them in the future, perhaps. The first is asking if we will be giving more specifics on data validation, such as hierarchy of blank contamination actions and handling multiple qualifications. So we can.
Oh, we can do that. Sure. Yep. Absolutely.
Let's. And then another question asking, how much reduction in time are you finding with projects that use DQM versus projects that are not using DQM?
Holly, we did do some actual time studies on that stuff. What do you want to answer that one?
Didn't we come up with, we were aiming for a 50% reduction in time and a 90% reduction in errors. As Dee talked about before, with DQM at the end, you can push a button or can tell it to apply the qualifiers. And so there's a significant reduction in qualifier application and error there. But I believe I believe we came up with 50% reduction in time.
I think that sounds right to me. And just keep in mind that you do still need to do some upfront work before you run DQM, and you still need, well, depending on what you're doing and what you want from the output, you may need to do some post DQM work to get it in whatever format you want it to be, or however you want the presentation to be. So if you're just putting it back into the database, and there really isn't a whole lot of post work to be done. So just,
right.
But yeah, 50% sounds like what we came up. We did actually, like set the timer and keep track for a while to see what it does.
Cool.
Great.
And maybe as we get better with it and we hone it a bit more to our purpose, it'll probably, hopefully improve too.
Increase. Right?
Yeah.
So there's another comment saying that one user evaluates their project limits automated using pivot tables in Excel currently. So they have it siloed in Excel, which certainly is a possibility. Mm-hmm. And then there's another question asking if there are any tools or strategies in EQuIS. Whoa, sorry, it just bumped on me and I lost the sentence. My apologies.
I can read it, Liz. The question is, are there any tools or strategies in EQuIS to qualify other types of data, like verifying well data or indicating data quality for well data?
That's an EarthSoft question if I ever heard one.
I think so.
Yeah.
Liz, what are your thoughts?
Oh boy. Probably.
Or Ruth may have a thought as well. Yeah, if you guys are up for it. If not, we can follow up.
Yeah, I think we can follow up with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking, that requires getting the stuff into a electronic notebook out in the field or after you come back. And then I don't see any reason why EarthSoft couldn't, if they don't already have things, couldn't build checks for that stuff, because as long as you've got it in an electronic format, you can make that go.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. There's probably several reports out there. I just don't know them off the top of my head. So, and then we have another question asking what the roadmap looks like for DQM. I can answer that sort of on a limited basis today, and then give you more information in the future. We have a relatively firm schedule for what we're going to be planning and building through the end of 2021. We have several different checks that we are either adding to or creating brand new, whether that means that we're improving things related to RPD checks for both the standard RPD as well as the RPD field checks and spike recoveries there as well. We're adding some calculations to some of those checks. We are adding the ability, as Dee mentioned earlier in one of the slides, the tracking and verification of sample preservation in terms of holding time. So if you have like 8260 data with a holding time that's going to vary based on whether your sample is preserved or unpreserved, there will be a mechanism in DQM to be able to say, oh, this guy is preserved and that guy's unpreserved. So you'll be able to apply the right holding time criteria per sample based on what's coming from those EDDs. Some other things, there'll be some user interface updates. You'll see the addition of a total versus dissolved check, some additional kinds of reason codes and ranking possibilities as well, and some updates to our reporting. We're going to make the validation report more complex and complete, and as well as different handlings of different blank check kind of things. So if you're going to elevate your reporting limit to the blank contamination level, things like that. I'm sure that there are some that I'm missing because I'm just reading my notes really quickly, but we will talk more about those in future sessions too. So
cool. Perfect. I think we basically have time for one last question. And so when we really have one more in here. So the question is, or it's a comment and then a question. So in my experience, I have found some errors in the lab reports that were not reflected in the EDDs. How is the EDD verified that all QC anomalies are captured?
Well, that's a good one, because if all you're doing is running DQM, you will not know. But that's why, that's what we're talking about. You still need to look. And you're right. I mean, oftentimes the lab reports do not match. That can be part of your completeness check too. I know we oftentimes do like a 10% random search, look at actual Form 1s, the analysis reports, match them up, because I've seen stuff reported in EDDs that wasn't on the reports, and vice versa. We've seen, reporting limits that don't match, results that, there's a gamut. So the only way to do that at this point is to look, eyes.
Yeah.
And I don't know of any way to do that differently at this point. So you're stuck with that one. There's still going to be 50% of the time that's spent doing, that's.
Yeah, for sure. Perfect. Well, excellent. Well, that pretty much takes us to the top of the hour here. So we'll wrap things up for our session today. The following session, so we have parts 2 and 3 of this. Those are going to be on October 6th and then October 20th at the same time. And if you're already registered for this session, which obviously you guys are, it's the same connection information to join us for those sessions as well. So you're welcome to come sit in with us. And I think we're going to get more into the nitty gritty in both of those sessions. So bring your coffee with you for sure. But we're excited to get into some more of the details, look a little bit more at the roadmap as well, and go from there. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to send them to me and Liz, and then we can share them with Dee and Polly and our folks, and we'll get that together for everybody, see how much we can cover in the next couple of sessions that maybe weren't on our original plan. So thanks, Dee. Thanks for presenting. That was awesome. Thanks, Polly, for putting that together with us and being here as well. And then for everybody else for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for the opportunity. We enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.